Most people think Filipino nurses came to America because the pay was better. That's not wrong, but it's not the reason. Here's the part that almost no one notices. The United States did not just attract Filipino nurses. It designed a system that quietly produced them, decades before the first plane ticket was ever booked. Look at any American hospital floor, ICU night shift, long-term care. You will hear a familiar accent over and over again. Calm voices, precise movements, endless patience. This isn't coincidence, and it's not just immigration. Because long before a Filipino nurse ever touched American soil, their training, their exams, even the language they used at work, were already shaped for the U.S. But to understand how that happened, you have to go back, not to hospitals, but to classrooms. And to a moment in history when the Philippines was being quietly rewritten. At the start of the 1900s, the Philippines didn't just change governments. It changed systems. Schools switched languages. Textbooks were replaced. Professional paths were redirected. English became the language of instruction. American-style education became the standard. And healthcare training followed American medical models, almost line by line. This wasn't done to send nurses abroad, at least not officially. It was done to create a workforce that could function inside an American system, anywhere that system needed labor. By the time the U.S. faced its first major nursing shortages, something unusual had already happened across the Pacific. There was an entire country producing nurses who spoke fluent English, followed U.S. medical protocols, and were culturally trained to work under American authority. No retraining, no language barrier, no adjustment period. Hospitals didn't have to adapt to Filipino nurses. Filipino nurses had already adapted to them. But here's where the story turns uncomfortable. Because while the system made migration possible, it didn't make it painless. Families began to separate. Caregivers left behind their own elderly parents. Mothers raised children through phone calls and remittances. Nursing became more than a job. It became an exit strategy. And slowly, quietly, it reshaped Filipino family life in ways most Americans never see. The question isn't just why there are so many Filipino nurses in the U.S. The real question is, who paid the price for building that pipeline? And why does it still keep running today? When a Filipino nurse leaves for the U.S., the story usually gets framed as success. A win, a family lifted out of poverty. But that framing hides something crucial. Because migration didn't just change where Filipino nurses worked. It changed who stayed behind to care for everyone else. In many Filipino hospitals, especially outside major cities, the most experienced nurses are often missing. Not because they weren't trained, but because the system trained them to leave. New graduates step into wards already understaffed. Senior nurses rotate through only long enough to gain experience, then disappear overseas. What's left is a constant cycle of teaching, losing, and starting again. This creates a strange contradiction. The Philippines is known globally for producing some of the best nurses in the world. Yet locally, patients often experience shortages, burnout, and overcrowded care. The country exports compassion while rationing it at home, and the emotional cost doesn't stop at hospitals. Children grow up with one parent abroad for years at a time. Birthdays are watched through phone screens. Illnesses are handled by relatives. Grief is postponed until vacation days line up with emergencies. Money flows in, presence flows out. Many nurses accept this trade-off not because they want to leave, but because staying doesn't feel viable. Wages at home often can't support extended families. Working conditions can be punishing, and the global demand keeps pulling harder. Over time, nursing stops being just a calling. It becomes an obligation. A role assigned to one sibling so everyone else can survive. And this raises an uncomfortable question that almost never gets asked. If Filipino nurses are holding together healthcare systems abroad, what happens to the system they leave behind? What makes this even more complicated is that the pipeline doesn't rely on force. It runs on expectation. In many Filipino families, becoming a nurse isn't just a career choice. It's a plan. High school students are guided toward nursing long before they understand what the job actually demands. Not because they love hospitals, but because everyone knows someone who made it abroad. Course brochures quietly align with U.S. requirements. Licensing exams mirror foreign standards. Review centers promise global mobility, not local service. From the very beginning, the finish line is imagined somewhere else. And this creates a subtle psychological shift. Nursing stops being rooted in community care. It becomes a passport. Students learn early that endurance matters more than rest, that obedience is safer than resistance. That emotional restraint is part of professionalism. These traits are praised as cultural strengths. But they also make Filipino nurses uniquely adaptable to high-pressure systems that others burn out of quickly. Hospitals abroad don't just need skills, they need reliability. They need workers who will stay calm during understaffed night shifts, accept overtime without complaint, and keep going when the system is stretched thin. Filipino nurses become known for exactly that. But here's the part rarely discussed. Adaptability can look a lot like silence. Many nurses hesitate to speak up about unsafe staffing ratios. Some endure discrimination quietly to avoid jeopardizing visas. Others delay reporting burnout because they're supporting entire households back home. The system doesn't have to exploit them aggressively. It only has to rely on their sense of responsibility. And slowly, a global healthcare structure forms where certain bodies absorb more pressure than others because they're conditioned to. This leads to a difficult question that lingers beneath the praise and gratitude. When resilience becomes expected, who decides how much strain is too much? There's another layer to this story that almost never shows up in hospital brochures or recruitment ads. Filipino nurses don't just cross borders, they enter hierarchies. In many American hospitals, they are everywhere, but rarely at the top. They staff the most demanding units. They take the longest shifts. They anchor night rotations that others avoid. And yet, leadership roles often come slower. This isn't always about skill, it's about perception. Accents get mistaken for lack of confidence. Quiet professionalism gets read as passivity. Respect for authority gets misread as consent. So many Filipino nurses learn an unspoken rule early on: work harder. Complain less, be indispensable but invisible. For immigrants on temporary visas, the stakes are even higher. Speaking up can feel risky. Changing jobs can threaten legal status. Pushing back can feel like gambling with an entire family's future. So endurance becomes strategy. What looks like cultural humility on the surface often masks calculated restraint. Not because they don't see the problems, but because they can't afford to be the ones who say them out loud. And this creates a strange paradox inside American healthcare. The system depends heavily on Filipino nurses to keep running smoothly, yet it rarely stops to ask how much pressure that dependence places on them. Praise replaces protection. Gratitude replaces reform. And over time, something subtle happens. A group becomes essential, but also taken for granted. Which leads to a final question that changes how you see every hospital hallway, every night shift, every calm voice answering a call bell. If an entire healthcare system quietly leans on one community to survive, what happens when that community finally reaches its limit? There's a reason this pattern has lasted so long. Because it doesn't collapse loudly, it holds together, just barely. Every year, more Filipino nurses arrive. New contracts, new visas, new promises. They fill gaps created by burnout, aging populations, and systems that refuse to slow down. From the outside, it looks like a win for everyone. Hospitals stay staffed, patients stay cared for. Families receive money that keeps households afloat back home. But beneath that balance is a fragile truth. The pipeline only works if sacrifice stays invisible. If separation is normalized, if silence is rewarded, if resilience keeps being mistaken for infinite capacity, and slowly signs of strain are becoming harder to ignore. More Filipino nurses are leaving bedside care earlier. More are speaking openly about burnout, racism, and emotional exhaustion. More are questioning whether the cost, missed childhoods, postponed grief, bodies worn down early, is still worth it. At the same time, the Philippines continues to train nurses for a world that keeps pulling them away. And the United States continues to rely on a workforce shaped by history, necessity, and restraint, without fully reckoning with what that reliance demands in return. This isn't a story about heroism, and it isn't a story about exploitation alone. It's a story about systems that quietly align, and the people who live inside the consequences of that alignment. The next time you walk through a hospital corridor late at night, and you hear that familiar, calm voice answering call after call, it's worth asking a different question. Not why are there so many Filipino nurses here, but how long can a system depend on sacrifice before it has to change? If this changed the way you see something you thought you already understood, subscribe. Not for praise, but to keep uncovering the stories hiding in plain sight.